In a quiet Glasgow flat, a man was asleep in his bed. His name was Haider Hayat. He was a father. He was a security guard. And in the early hours of April 3rd, 2018, his life would come to a horrific end. While 8 children slept in nearby rooms, a merciless attack began. The sounds were so violent, a neighbor was woken by the voice. Thumping, groaning, the sounds of a brutal, sustained assault. When police finally arrived, they found a bizarre scene and a story that made no sense. What really happened inside the flats? Why was Haider Hayat targeted with such extreme violence? And what secrets were hidden on the home's own CCTV system? To help us continue making sure these stories are heard, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it.
Haider Hayat was a 49-year-old security guard and a father to 5 children. He lived with his 34-year-old wife, Saima Hayat, in a flat on Rathburn Road in the Castlemilk area of Glasgow, Scotland. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a normal family home. But inside the walls of the apartment, a dark and manipulative dynamic was at play. For at least 4 years, Saima had been the abusive partner in the relationship. She harbored a deep malice and ill will toward her husband, a history punctuated by multiple assaults that would later be presented as evidence in court. Saima had previously claimed that she was the victim, alleging that she had been forced to flee their former family home in Warrington, England, because of Haider's behavior. But a judge would later look at the evidence and conclude the opposite, calling Saima a manipulative, scheming woman. Saima's closest confidant was her best friend, 33-year-old Shahida Abid. Shahida was married to 42-year-old Muhammed Rauf. Both Shahida and Muhammad were failed asylum seekers, and their lives were deeply intertwined with Saima's. The 3 friends formed a tight-knit group, bound by loyalty and shared secrets. By the spring of 2018, those secrets had festered into a murderous plot. The target was Saima's husband, Haider. The flat on Rathburn Road was wired with a network of CCTV cameras, with at least one in every room. The system was meant to provide security, but on the night of Monday, April 2nd, 2018, it would instead become a silent witness to the prelude of a horrific crime. In the final hours of Haider Hayat's life, the cameras in the living room captured chilling, unspoken threats. Shahida Abid, Saima's best friend, was recorded looking toward the camera and slowly, deliberately, drawing a finger across her throat in a universally understood cutthroat gesture. A short time later, Saima Hayat was also recorded making menacing motions. She pantomimed a stabbing action, first toward her own eyes, then toward her stomach. The prosecutor who later presented this footage to a jury would state that the video clearly showed what they were planning. Minutes after these gestures were recorded, the entire CCTV system inside the flat was deliberately disconnected. The home's electronic eyes were now blind. It was in the early hours of Tuesday, April 3rd. Haider Hayat was most likely asleep in his bed, completely unaware of the violence that was about to be unleashed upon him. In the other rooms of the flat, 8 children were also sleeping. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the night was shattered. A downstairs neighbor was jolted awake by a sudden and alarming noise from the flat directly above. It was a series of heavy, rhythmic thumps. The sounds were persistent and deeply unsettling. The neighbor also heard what sounded like pained groaning and whimpering, the unmistakable noises of a man in severe distress. The commotion was so frightening that the neighbor began recording the sounds on a device, capturing an audio record of the brutal events unfolding upstairs. The thumping and groaning continued, unabated, for over 6 minutes. Inside the flat, Muhammed Rauf was carrying out the plan his wife and Saima Hayat had helped orchestrate. Armed with a hammer and a knife, he launched a merciless and sustained attack on the defenseless Haider Hayat. The assault was an act of extreme brutality. Rauf struck Haider on the head with the hammer at least 100 times. The force was so catastrophic that a pathologist would later describe Haider's skull as having been effectively demolished into small pieces. As his victim lay dying, Rauf then took the knife and slashed Haider's throat at least 16 times. A judge would later surmise that these final, vicious cuts were likely inflicted when Haider was already in the final moments of his life. By the time the assault ended, Haider Hayat was dead. The official cause of death would be listed as blunt force injury to the head. For the next 2 hours, the flat was not a home, but the scene of a frantic and clumsy cover-up. Muhammed Rauf, having carried out the physical act of murder, then took charge of the clean-up operation. He instructed Saima and Shahida on what to do. They tried to clean the premises, dispose of any bloodstained clothing, and get rid of the incriminating CCTV footage that they had disconnected just before the attack. Their most elaborate and preposterous invention, however, was the story they concocted to tell the police. They planned to present themselves not as perpetrators, but as victims of a home invasion. At 5 a.m., a full 2 hours after Haider had been killed, a call was finally placed to the police. When officers arrived at the Rathburn Road flat, they were met with a bizarre and confusing scene. They found Haider Hayat's body, which bore the marks of an incredibly violent death. And they found Saima Hayat and Shahida Abid bound with tape. The two women, along with Muhammed Rauf, immediately launched into their fabricated tale. They claimed that 3 unknown male intruders had broken into the flat. These intruders, they alleged, had worked with Haider to tie up the 2 women and all 8 children. They added a strange and dramatic detail, insisting that the intruders and Haider had then injected them all with unknown chemicals. In this fictional narrative, Muhammed Rauf was the hero. He had, according to their story, arrived at the flat to find this terrifying scene in progress. To save his wife, Saima, and the children, he was forced to fight and kill Haider. The story was so dramatic and involved such specific claims of chemical injections involving children that it triggered a massive emergency response. A fleet of 8 ambulances was dispatched to the scene. The 8 children and the 2 women were all taken to the hospital for immediate medical evaluation, but their elaborate lie quickly began to fall apart. At the hospital, doctors performed tests on Saima, Shahida, and every one of the children. The results were conclusive. There was nothing medically wrong with any of them. They had not been injected with any chemicals. Back at the crime scene, detectives began their investigation. The cover-up was, in the words of a judge, hapless. Evidence of the clean-up attempt was obvious to trained investigators, and the trio's story of intruders simply did not align with the physical evidence in the flat. As police canvassed the building, they spoke to the downstairs neighbor, who handed over the audio recording. Investigators now had a chilling, 6-minute soundtrack of the murder itself. They also discovered that the flat had been equipped with a comprehensive CCTV system, which had been conveniently turned off right before the attack. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and they did not point to a home invasion. They pointed directly at the 3 people who had reported the crime. The local community was shocked by the brutal killing, and police publicly thanked residents for providing information that helped the investigation. In early April 2018, just days after the murder, Muhammed Rauf was arrested and charged. His wife, Shahida Abid, was arrested and charged by the middle of the month. Saima Hayat, the victim's wife, was also arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. The 3 were also charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice, which included inducing the child witnesses present in the home to provide a false account to police. In February 2019, the trial of Muhammed Rauf, Shahida Abid, and Saima Hayat began at the High Court in Glasgow, with Judge Lady Ray presiding. The prosecution, led by Richard Goddard QC, laid out its case, arguing that this was a premeditated and planned murder, not a spontaneous act of violence. The jury was shown the pre-murder CCTV footage from the living room. They watched as Shahida Abid made the cutthroat gesture, and as Saima Hayat mimed the act of stabbing. The prosecution presented the chilling audio recording captured by the neighbor, forcing the court to listen to the sounds of Haider Hayat's final, agonizing moments. The pathologist, Dr. Marjorie Turner, testified about the extent of the injuries. She confirmed that Haider had suffered at least 100 blows to his head and neck, resulting in multiple fractures to his skull, a broken jaw, and a broken cheekbone. The jury heard evidence of Saima's 4-year history of malice and assaults against her husband, establishing a clear pattern of hostility. When it was his turn to testify, Muhammed Rauf took the stand and admitted to killing Haider. However, he tried to mitigate his actions by offering conflicting excuses. First, he claimed that Haider had made offensive remarks about his wife and his mother, and in a moment of uncontrollable rage, he snapped. He told the court, "I was very angry. I don't know what happened, how many times I struck him. When I came back to my senses, I was on top of him. My hand was on his mouth, and there was blood everywhere." But he also offered a different, contradictory defense, claiming he acted to protect his family. He stated, "If I hadn't done anything, he could have killed me and my children. I had no intention of killing anyone. It was just accidental." Saima Hayat and Shahida Abid chose not to give evidence. They remained silent, maintaining their innocence through their legal counsel. Their defense rested on the hope that the jury would believe the initial, fabricated story of intruders. On Thursday, February 14, 2019, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Muhammed Rauf, Shahida Abid, and Saima Hayat all guilty of the murder of Haider Hayat. Saima and Shahida were also convicted of attempting to pervert the course of justice for their roles in the cleanup and the cover story. Saima was additionally convicted on the charge related to her history of malice and ill will toward her husband. As the verdicts were read, the three showed no emotion. Judge Lady Ray addressed them directly before they were taken away. "It is difficult to find the words," she said. "This was clearly a premeditated and planned killing of an innocent man. You attempted to blacken his character. This was a brutal and merciless attack, and you are all guilty because you were involved in the planning of it. I certainly have detected no remorse from any of you." A month later, on Tuesday, March 19, 2019, the trio returned to the High Court for sentencing. Judge Lady Ray handed down life sentences to all three. For Muhammed Rauf, she set a minimum punishment part of 24 years. For Shahida Abid and Saima Hayat, she imposed a longer minimum term of 25 years and 6 months, citing their additional conviction for attempting to pervert the course of justice and, in Saima's case, the history of domestic abuse against the victim. Following the sentencing, all three launched an appeal, arguing that their sentences were excessive. The appeal was heard later that year by a panel of 3 judges: Lord Justice Clerk, Lady Dorian, Lord Menzies, and Lord Turnbull. Muhammed Rauf's lawyer argued on a comparative basis, citing other cases to suggest his punishment was too severe. The legal teams for Shahida and Saima argued that the judge had not given enough weight to mitigating factors and had wrongly speculated about their direct involvement in the physical assault. They contended it was unfair for them to receive longer sentences than the man who was, by his own admission, the primary physical assailant. On Friday, November 8, 2019, the appeal court delivered its judgment. The judges dismissed Muhammed Rauf's appeal. They noted the intense, severe and brutal degree of violence he had personally inflicted and concluded that his 24-year punishment part was not excessive. However, the court partially agreed with the arguments for the 2 women. Lady Dorian, delivering the opinion of the court, stated that while Saima and Shahida were clearly guilty of planning the murder, their conviction was based on being part of a concerted effort, not on being primary physical actors. The sustained and merciless attack, she noted, was at the hand of the first appellant, Muhammed Rauf. The court described their subsequent cover-up attempt as hapless and relatively limited in scope. Therefore, the judges ruled there was no sufficient basis for them to serve longer minimum terms than the main attacker. The appeals for Shahida Abid and Saima Hayat were allowed to the extent that their punishment parts were reduced. Their minimum terms were equalized with Rauf's, and all 3 now faced a minimum of 24 years in prison before they could be considered for parole. Release, the court clarified, would not be automatic, but would depend on a future parole board's assessment of their risk to the public. The brutal and senseless murder of Haider Hayat, a crime planned by his own wife and her best friend and executed with chilling ferocity, had left 5 children without a father and a community struggling to understand how such violence could erupt inside a family home.
The brutal murder of Haider Hayat raises profound questions about the nature of intimate partner violence and how it can escalate to a lethal boiling point. While cases involving female perpetrators are less common, the underlying dynamics of control, planning, and escalation often share common traits. Groundbreaking research helps shed light on the specific red flags that can predict these tragic outcomes. One of the most significant studies in this area was conducted by researcher Jacqueline Campbell and her colleagues. Published in the American Journal of Public Health, their work sought to identify concrete risk factors for lethal violence and abusive relationships. By comparing the cases of hundreds of women who were killed by their partners to a control group of abused women who survived, the researchers were able to quantify the warning signs. They found that a perpetrator's access to a weapon was one of the strongest predictors of a lethal outcome. Another major risk factor was unemployment. The study also identified that a combination of extreme controlling behavior from the abuser, especially when combined with a recent separation, created a very high-risk situation. Other important markers included prior threats with a weapon and the presence of stepchildren in the home. The findings from Campbell's research have been instrumental. They form the basis of practical tools like the danger assessment used by police and multi-agency teams to identify high-risk cases and intervene before it's too late. The research provides a framework for understanding that lethal violence is rarely a spontaneous event. Instead, it is often the final act in a pattern of escalating control and aggression. In the case of Haider Hayat, the documented planning, the disconnection of CCTV, and the sheer brutality of the weaponized attack all reflects the kind of critical risk factors that this research warns us to recognize. Thank you for watching. See you on another episode.